everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this pre-recorded session entitled Heat Safety in the Workplace, Reducing Risk of Heat-Related Injuries and Illnesses. My name is Maggie Morrissey, or Margaret Morrissey, and I am the Director of Occupational and Military Safety at the Corey Stringer Institute, which is housed at the University of Connecticut. And I'm also the President of the National Heat Safety Coalition, which is a division of the Corey Stringer Institute, which is entirely focused on preventing heat-related injuries and illnesses in laborers. And so I'm very excited today to speak on this topic. I also wanted to share, I am fortunate enough to be the secretary of the AIHA Thermal Working Group that was just created. So I'm very thrilled to be here to share my expertise. My co-presenter, Gabrielle Brewer, was unable to attend the pre-recording, but will be there for the live session. And before I proceed, I do want to inform everyone what the National Heat Safety Coalition is. And so I mentioned before, it's a division of the Corey Stringer Institute. And this division was created through a partnership with Maggot and Mission, two companies who care very deeply about preventing heat-related injuries and illnesses in this population. And what we do is really create heat stress awareness through our website. We provide heat safety services such as on-site heat safety assessments. So we would go on-site, review what you currently have in place in terms of your heat safety practices, and then provide recommendations. We also have a research agenda entirely focused on expanding heat stress research within the occupational space. And as I mentioned before, we're also providing heat safety solutions that are specifically tailored to your workplace. And so for this presentation, there'll be two main learning objectives. The first objective being to summarize the importance of heat stress prevention strategies that need to be implemented to protect workers. And then the second objective, really summarizing best practices for heat stroke recognition as well as treatment. And so many of you are probably aware of the detrimental effects that heat has, especially due to climate change. So this risk is just increasingly getting worse. And that is one of the reasons why OSHA decided to move forward with the heat stress standard rulemaking process, because we really need to have better protection for our workers. And so occupational heat stress can have significant effects on your physiology. So it can cause kidney injury in conjunction with dehydration, cardiac strain, heat illness, so hyperthermia, fall and injury risk. I already mentioned dehydration, but then also fatigue. And these are just examples. And so a statistic coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed that 11 workers per day are seriously injured or die from heat stress. And one of the most alarming things about this is it is incredibly underreported. And so a study that was recently released by Park in 2021 reported that just in California alone, looking at worker compensation claims, there was an additional 20,000 heat-related workplace injuries, and these weren't accounted for. So they weren't really tagged as caused by heat. And so we really don't know the significance of the impact of heat. And so, we're really trying to do that and be able to recognize that this is a significant threat. And so one thing I really like to bring up to everyone is that, and I think it's pretty obvious, no one should die from a preventable illness. And so heat-related injuries and illnesses are very preventable. And so really you just have to have the right heat prevention strategies in place in order to better protect your workers. And sometimes this has to be specifically tailored based on the industry you have, as well as the physical demands of the job or the environment. And so also you want to consider having best practices for recognition as well as treatment of exertional heat stroke, which is a medical emergency and very critical. You must get their body temperature below or to their normal conditions within 30 minutes. And I'll discuss that in a little bit. But really what today we're going to be talking about two levels of prevention. So the first is really what do we do to prevent a heat-related injury and illness from happening in the first place? So this would really be the heat prevention strategies. And then we also want to talk about another level of prevention, and is really preventing the fatality from occurring. So as many of you are probably aware that no matter how many prevention strategies you put in place in relation to any hazard, there's always a risk of having some sort of a medical emergency. And so if that does occur, you have to be ready, and you have to be able to treat them or recognize what, the condition is, so that you can save this person's life. And so first, we're going to talk about prevention in the first place, right? So how can we prevent this from happening in terms of heat-related injuries and illnesses? And so the National Heat Safety Coalition, one of our first accomplishments was really publishing this article in GeoHealth. And so what it was is a heat safety occupational consensus document. And so we're providing strategies and resources that employers or supervisors can use that can essentially provide them with recommendations to better protect their workers. And so to run you through how this came to be and what the process was, is the objective was we wanted to develop concise, evidence-based, and feasible recommendations that were not only going to enhance the health and safety of workers, but also we wanted to preserve productivity. And so this all started from a roundtable meeting that happened December 10th, 2020. And so we had 52 experts across many different disciplines related to occupational heat stress were part of this roundtable. And we had 8 different topic areas. And so listed here, we have heat hygiene, hydration, heat acclimatization, environmental monitoring, physiological monitoring, body cooling, textiles and personal protective gear, as well as emergency action plan implementation. And so everyone was divided into these 8 different topics. The topic groups created recommendations based on the topic, and then each recommendation was systematically scored based on its scientific evidence, its feasibility, and its clarity. And this was all scored by these 52 experts. And so the document was officially published in September in GeoHealth, and it's open access. So anybody has access to this document, and it contains 40 recommendations. And so today we're not going to have the chance to talk about every single topic area, but as I mentioned before, these were the 8 prevention strategies that we had listed in this document. And I wanted to touch base on a few of them because they're really important. They have to be put in place in order to protect your workers. And so first, I wanted to start with what you can do to really improve your workers' tolerance to heat and really their education surrounding exertional heat illness and injury. And so that would start with heat safety education and training. And so what components you want to have in this, and this training should occur during onboarding as well as an annual training, because it's really important to reiterate these facts, but also there's new research that's continuously being added, and we're learning more and more about heat and its effects, that you do want to keep up and make sure the information you're providing is current. And so some of the things to include would be risk factors for heat-related injuries and illnesses, prevention strategies, as I had mentioned previously, first aid for heat-related illnesses, as well as what the emergency response procedures would be if someone's having exertional heat stroke or another form of heat illness. And so everyone really needs to know what would put them at risk for heat illness. And then there's a lot of things that contribute to it. And on this slide here is a list of some of them. So this would include the environment, low consumption of fluids, solar radiation, so either the effect of the sun or even machines that you may have for indoor workers that are putting off radiant heat, limited airflow or ventilation, your physical demands. So if you're performing really physical work, you may be at risk for heat illness, even if there isn't extreme, heat in terms of the environment. You also, if you don't have any work regulations related to heat, mitigation strategies that could cause you to be at risk, bulky protective clothing, smoking, tobacco use, poor diet, certain medications, sleep deprivation, very excessive caffeine, as well as individual characteristics. So if someone has obesity, if someone has diabetes, these all could essentially increase your risk. So it's something that every worker should acknowledge and be able to recognize this, especially if they have some of these risk factors. And so, as I just mentioned, individual characteristics. So here are some other conditions that really are associated with heat intolerance. So I had mentioned diabetes, I had mentioned obesity, but a sedentary lifestyle. So if you have a low fitness level, you're at much greater risk for exertional heat illness, heart diseases, hypertension, kidney disease, and pregnancy. These are just examples. There are more, but something that everyone should be, should understand. And then also for hydration, this is probably one of the most utilized heat stress mitigation strategies. And so as a reminder, yes, it's very important to make sure workers bring water on their work site or water is provided. But you do need to consider the individual needs of the workers, the physical demands of the work. So if a worker is working, 10 times harder than what they typically do, and it happens to be on a hot day, they're likely going to need more hydration, or could even need some electrolyte beverages to enhance their ability to be hydrated. And so there's also worksite logistics. So if individuals are provided water, but it's a half mile, from their work site, they're very, less likely to consume fluids. Or if they don't have access to a bathroom right away, especially women workers, they are less likely to consume fluids because they don't want to have to keep walking and going to the restroom. So you need to make sure fluids as well as restrooms are easily accessible for everyone. And so also individuals should be educated on how they can tell if they're hydrated or not. And so since we really want to consider methods that are easy to do and can be performed in the field. And so one of those being a urine color chart. So looking whether or not you have light colored urine, which would indicate hydration. And you can count the number of voids you have. So over 5 voids would be considered moderate hydration. And whether or not you have a thirst sensation or not. So people tend to not to say don't stick to your thirst mechanism. However, in some instances, it might be the only thing that you'll be able to dictate whether or not you're hydrated. So heat acclimatization is a really important one as well, especially because the risk of heat-related injuries and illnesses is much more prevalent within the first 3 days of work. So that would be for a new worker who's starting a job, or someone who has already done the job, but they've had a prolonged absence from work. So they're kind of restarting again. And so what heat acclimatization is it's repeated gradual progression to the hot environment and the physical demands that are within that environment, so that someone can have physiological adaptations that will allow them to tolerate the heat better. And so, as I mentioned, it's gradual and progressive. So you're slowly introducing the individual to their working conditions. And so this should typically happen over a 5 to 7 day period. And so an example of this would be on their first day of work, they're only performing 50% of their day. And then during that 5 to 7 day period, they're slowly increasing the percentage of what they do. And another important factor is environmental monitoring. So the gold standard, or the industry standard that we would consider is wet bulb globe temperature. And the reason why is because this particular metric not only looks at ambient temperature and humidity, but also wind speed. It's able to calculate that and radiant heat. And so a wet bulb globe temperature monitor can be placed right on site. So you could put it on a tripod right within your working conditions, and then you're able to actually assess what the environment is on your work site. So a lot of the times people are using weather apps, and yes, that's really important when you're trying to plan out what, what you need in terms of heat stress prevention for the week. But it's not going to actually give you a truly accurate assessment of what's happening in your environment. And so what you should do is really use the WBGT monitor to create environment-based work modifications. So your work to rest ratios. And so on top of environmental monitoring, body cooling is very underutilized and can not only help in terms of health and safety, but also enhance productivity. And so I wanted to provide some examples of some that can be used in a relatively remote setting. And so there's extremity immersion, air movements such as fans, cooling vests. So this can either be conductive or evaporative. You have hand cooling, head cooling, cooling towels, water dowsing, so just spraying water on yourself, as well as ice slushy consumption. And so with really any cooling device, there are some things that I like to inform individuals to enhance the body cooling modality's effectiveness. And so first, you really want to cover as much body surface area with that device as possible. So if you have a bunch of cooling towels, that may, be a really good option, especially if you're in a really remote setting. But you do want to make sure you're covering those as much body surface or how much coverage as you can on your body with the cold product. So for example, if you have a towel, you do want to make sure it's continuously cold. So you're not placing it all over your body and it gets hot very quickly. And then it's not essentially able to cool you very well. And so you also want to think about what cooling strategy would be the most effective for your work site. So if you don't have any power, it might not be a good idea to use a conductive vest, because a lot of the times the conductive vests have inserts for ice packs. And so you might not have a place to be able to put it back in the freezer and then replenish it. So it's something to think about. And also within these considerations, you want to think about whether or not your workers are able to remove their PPE or not. So if you're in an extremely hazardous environment in terms of, chemical hazards or things like that, you might not be able to take off any of your PPE. So maybe a vest underneath could be an appropriate solution. So it really depends on your work environment. And so really lastly of the prevention strategies is you should really have an emergency action plan for really any medical emergency, but specifically I'm just going to be talking about heat policies and procedures. And so you should have this emergency action plan, and it should be created by a worksite manager and a medical professional. And these individuals really should be creating, managing, coordinating, and executing this plan. And so it's important that everyone is aware of what is included in this emergency action plan, so that if an emergency were to occur, everyone's able to perform these life-saving procedures. And in some contexts, there's a lot of them that only can be performed by medical professionals. That's not, exactly what I'm saying, but everyone should be aware what their role is within the emergency action plan. And so that was an overview of the prevention in the sense of preventing the heat-related injury and illness from happening to begin with. And the last piece we're going to talk about is preventing fatality. So at this point, the prevention strategies did not work, and you have someone who's suffering from an exertional heat illness, or exertional heat stroke. And so what needs to happen to save this person's life? And so it's really important that everyone is educated on the signs and symptoms of exertional heat stroke. And so the two that are in red are the two diagnostic criteria. So someone who's having an exertional heat stroke will have extreme hyperthermia, so greater than 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And they'll also have altered consciousness. So this is what we call essentially central nervous system dysfunction. And so this could present as disorientation, confusion, things like that. So very bizarre, often erratic behavior. So something to consider. And then as well as the other symptoms here. So headache, dizziness, nausea. So everyone should be aware of what to look out for. And so for the emergency procedures for exertional heat stroke, the really important thing is you absolutely must have this person's body temperature down within 30 minutes. And so the most effective way to do this is whole body cold water immersion. And this is considered the gold standard treatment. So you can see in the upper right there's an individual who's in the tub and everyone is surrounding, keeping him in the tub. So whole body from the neck down and circulating the water to be able to facilitate cooling. And the reason why whole body is so important is because it has the highest cooling rate. So it's the most effective method to be able to cool your body. And so an important thing too, in order to successfully diagnose a heat stroke, you do have to have a core temperature assessment. And so in the field, the gold standard is rectal thermometry. And so of course you may not have medical professionals who are on site that are able to facilitate this. So if you at all think that someone may be having an exertional heat stroke, you want to make sure that you cool them as fast as possible. And so assume that it is an exertional heat stroke, because that could be something that could save their life. And so again, number one goal, get their temperature down within 30 minutes. And so the reason again being that the longer you go with your temperature high, the greater risk you're going to have for having long-term complications, permanent complications, or even death. So the time is very, very critical. And so in summary, you really need to utilize heat stress prevention strategies such as environmental monitoring, hydration, everything that I previously discussed in order to prevent a heat-related injury and illness from happening in the first place. And then you have to be aware of what to do when someone has an exertional heat stroke and have emergency procedures to save that person's life. So you may need to educate your EMS individuals who are the ones closest to you who are going to respond to a medical emergency about exertional heat stroke, or there may be a medical professional that is on site who's able to perform these. Or you have a cold water tub, you're in a remote setting, you're able to put that person in the tub in order to reduce their temperature. These are all things that need to be considered, again, because this is life-saving information. And so thank you so much for listening to the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at margaret.morrissey@uconn.edu. You can also visit the website heatsafetycoalition.com, and we have our social media accounts at the bottom.